We will be discussing challenges and opportunities for food contact materials here with 4 sessions in total, and this is the 4th and last session in this webinar series. And today we focus on how to deal with complexity and improve the European food contact materials regulation. We will hear 2 very different perspectives on how and why chemicals need to be regulated differently to better protect human health and the environment. The Food Packaging Forum is the host of this webinar, and I welcome you very warmly. We share knowledge and do our own research, and we encourage critical thinking. We work at the science policy interface. This webinar series is intended to provide scientific background that will support policymakers and influencers in their mission to implement the chemical strategy for sustainability in a smart and science-based way. And today's session is also an official partner event of the European Green Week. So first, some housekeeping announcements. We are recording this webinar today and we'll publish it on our website after the event. We kindly ask you also to please rename yourselves in Zoom using the convention shown here on the slide. Please mute yourselves, and during the presentations by our guest speakers, we kindly ask you to also turn off your video. Thanks for that. After the second presentation today, we will have time for questions and for discussion, and we invite all questions and comments that will help all participants to understand different perspectives and that support clarifying the issue for everyone. If you would like to ask a question, please use raise hand in the Zoom function or type your question directly into the chat. And I will then ask you to unmute yourself and turn on your camera to ask your question, or I can also read out your question from the chat if you prefer that. Okay, so what is the chemical strategy for sustainability? This is an official European Commission strategy document published in October 2020 that lays out the EU's plans for reforming its chemicals regulations. The document sets goals for many different aspects of chemicals management, and many of the specifics still need to be defined. For example, the criteria for safe and sustainable by design chemicals, or what constitutes an essential use of a known hazardous chemical, and so on. In any case, and speaking in very general terms, the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, or CSS, addresses the need of aligning the use of chemicals with the goals of the circular economy. So how can this be done? This is exactly what we're exploring in this webinar series. From various scientific experts, we've heard about relevant issues that are important. In our first session in March, we were focused on setting the scene and providing a backdrop for why the chemical strategy for sustainability is important and what our experts recommend in terms of its implementation. And a recording of this session is available on our website. If you haven't seen it yet, I strongly encourage you to take a look. Both presentations were excellent. The second session in April was a deep dive into the issue of endocrine disruption, the scientific background, and why this is an important topic. And we also took a closer look at the opportunities for implementing mixture toxicity assessment in different areas of EU chemicals regulation. Again, both excellent talks are available on our website. The third session last month then showcased 2 very different aspects of plastic packaging. For one, we learned about plastics as a material and how its circularity can be increased from a materials science perspective. The second talk looked at known hazardous chemicals in plastic packaging and highlighted how challenging it is to actually know all chemical constituents of plastics, even for food packaging. And finally, today's agenda is focused on the way forward. So we have 2 great speakers here today with different backgrounds, but they have one thing in common. They're both called Martin. And so I think this could become a challenge for us during the discussion, but we'll see. Regardless, I'm very happy to welcome both speakers. And we're joined by Martin Hojsík, who's a member of the European Parliament and native to Slovakia. Martin has a master's degree in molecular biology and has been focusing his professional life on changing the world into a better place. For example, with his work at the animal rights organization 4 Paws, where he was an executive board member. He's been a member of the European Parliament since 2019. And with that, a warm welcome to you, Martin, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts on how European citizens and the environment should be better protected from hazardous chemicals. Our second speaker is Professor Martin Scheringer from ETH Zürich, Switzerland, and he's also associated with the Masaryk University in Brno in the Czech Republic. Martin is an environmental chemist, and he too is working tirelessly to provide scientific facts for policymakers with the aim of better protecting people and planet from chemical pollution and hazardous chemicals in everyday life. And Martin is also the president of the Food Packaging Forum Foundation. Also to you, Martin, a warm welcome and thank you for taking the time to be here today. And with that, finally, I would like to open the floor and invite Martin Hojsík to share his thoughts with us. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. I have to say, I was considering for a while to make the entire speak in acronyms, essentially talking about how CSS needs to lead to reform of the FCM, because we really need to address the CMRs, EDCs, PBTs, and generally SVHCs to protect public health. But I guess that would be a bit too fast and a bit too short for such an important topic. Now, indeed, we have a problem, and I'm very happy that besides the focus of this discussion, which are essentially hazardous chemicals, there was an important element of the circularity. Because what we have to keep in mind is that at the end of the day, also in terms of the food packaging, and not just as a policymaker, but also as consumer, I have to say I'm driven crazy by the over packaging, and lots of the packaging is the food contact materials at the end. And I think what we also should remember is, because talking of circularity, that there is very important element that is often forgotten in the food packaging, and that's the waste hierarchy, the need to focus on waste prevention, reuse, and the kind of recycling is somewhere in the middle. It's not all the way bad, but it's somewhere in the middle. So let's not also forget about the need to reduce the material flow, not just the way making the materials thinner, but really kind of how we overall can reduce it and close the material loop. And when closing the material loop, this is going to have ultimately also profound implications on the food contact materials, because I'm pretty sure one of the challenges that many of you in the business face is the fact that there are high standards for the materials, although as I will talk later on, we generally acknowledge this is still full of loopholes for hazardous chemicals, yet it's hard to kind of use recycled content in them because of the quality. So this is yet another thing we need to address, but address we must. Now, the thing is that at the moment, we have indeed, as I said, the problem with hazardous chemicals in food content materials. Historically, it's been linked to plastic, and plastic has been the, so to say, the bad guy. And in the food contact materials, I think the polycarbonate with the bisphenol A, but not only polycarbonate, has been kind of the icon of hazardous chemical. But the evidence is showing that this is not only concerning the plastic, and there was a recent BEUC report to show that they're also sadly present in non-plastic alternatives, which gave with me a rise to a higher level of concern as the policy speak goes. So the estimate is over 8,000 different chemicals used to produce and treat the food contact materials, and those are just the intentionally added. There are a number of the unintentional chemicals in there, and therefore we don't know enough about what the people are exposed to. Now, what we have is a situation where, also with the paper and cardboard and others, there is still lack of specific rule on the EU level. And with the European Green Deal and the chemical and CSS, I'll occasionally use the acronyms, but so the chemical strategy for sustainability, I believe we have opening for really a paradigm shift on how we approach this issue, in a way that will not maintain, from my point of view, increase the level of protection of human health and environment, while at the same time, we will encourage and stimulate innovation, and so how to increase also the competitiveness of the European industry. Now, the fact that we have lack of protection within the food contact materials area is known. The legislation, it's been introduced in '76, in the last millennium. Sounds too nice, but really haven't been properly evaluated. And there are gaps known. DG Sanko back in 2012 came up with the first roadmap for reforming, and I have to say, even by European standards, this is slow. And the roadmap for reform recognized the gaps. There was 2016 European Parliament study. There was a large majority motion for resolution when the Parliament called for implementation of on action on this area, and we're sitting in 21 and we haven't moved sufficiently. So what are the main areas? Now, one thing is, we're talking about single market, but with the food contact materials, we lack one. We have like a defined level of safety, really don't have appropriate legal basis for industry to carry out compliance work. There are different rules between the member states. So this is something where I hope that we will see in the discussion quite a bit of shared views between the, so to say, the NGO world and the businesses, because I think for both sides, having a Europe-wide rules is something which, if they're adequate, is highly welcome. So there are no international rules similar to Codex Alimentarius. So I think this is something where we clearly a gap. And this, let's be honest, self-regulation via the industry guidance has not reached the necessary level of implementation nor agreement. And this is causing problems for the functioning of the EU market. So that's one area. And not to forget the imports. Because we don't have common rules as EU, we have a problem of controlling imports. And this is something, again, which is making us vulnerable to hazardous chemicals as consumers. But I think also it creates an burden and a certain level of disadvantage for European businesses. Now, the positive authorized list approach is lacking the focus on the final article. The rules are very, very complex and practical problem, and there are practical problems in their implementation. And the capacity to risk assess, and this is something which is, sounding even worse here, I'm realizing, because I'm also dealing with the issue of pesticides, and there is a problem with the kind of capacity for risk assessment. But the data I have shown me that actually with the capacity we have now, it would take 500 years to assess all the substances used in non-harmonized food contact materials. So, and this is not taking into account the need to re-evaluate the substances when a new scientific evidence emerges. So I think this is clearly also a massive gap. Now, other thing is the lack of prioritization. We do not consistently, under the current legislative approach, we do not consistently prioritize the most hazardous substances in food contact materials. And that, the fitness check clearly highlighted that there is lack of coherence in taking a more precautionary approach to regulating particular groups of substances compared with other EU consumer product legislation. Now, also the current framework lacks a mechanism to swiftly take into account new scientific information. So when there is a new data coming into the play, for example, submitted within the REACH, this is not picked up enough, and also being the coordinator for European Chemicals and Agency within the Parliament, or the contact person. This is where it's kind of clear gap and I would say policy framework mishap and between food contact materials and REACH. We don't really have a mechanism to take into account this information, and we need, I think, generally improve the approach, and one substance, one assessment is something which comes into mind on this. Now, of course, food contact materials are about supply chain, because the consumer is actually buying food, not the FCM. Not necessarily as consumer so interested in the packaging as in the final product. Therefore, also it's important to realize that also the food producers are essentially the customers of the packaging producers, and they are customers of the chemical industry and so on. And this is where we need to kind of ensure and improve the compliance information flow along the supply chain to streamline it really. Other thing is the enforcement of rules is generally poor. There have been difficulties among the member states encountered in enforcing the rules. There is not what is not taken into account sufficiently is the specificity. It's a crazy day today of SMEs, and I think this is something which we have to keep in mind. How to, on one hand, so to say, not undercut the protection of the environment. On the other hand, ensure a level playing field for the SMEs in this area. Very importantly, the current rules do not encourage development of safer and more sustainable alternative. As I said, it's not only about the safety, kind of the hazardness. I'm a fan of looking at chemicals through their intrinsically hazardous properties or non-hazardous. But there is the link to circular economy, but also generally the question of energy needs or the potential impacts on biodiversity is something where we really need to make rules that encourage the development of safer and more sustainable materials. And we need to revise the definitions. So there are lots of different areas that need to be addressing. Realizing I'm taking all the 15 minutes. So there are two main options. One is to take the current regulatory framework, so the 1935/2004, and revise it and trying to improve it, or take a fresh look and replace the regulation with something which would be more fit for purpose, that would kind of recognize the fact that the world has moved on and kind of recognize not just the challenges, but also the opportunities that we have now on improving the system. And in my view, the way to go is to build something new. I think this is where it's really a unique chance to implement the CSS and transition towards safe and sustainable by design, both for the chemicals, the materials, as well as the product. Harmonize the regulation of all types of food contact materials and articles, prohibit or phase out with a system that will really encourage substitution of hazardous chemicals. So the substance is a very high concern under the REACH legislation, and ban all the endocrine disrupting substances. Reduce the diversity of food contact chemicals and materials. This is something which indeed complicates the game in my view, and also complicates the circularity. Phase out the most problematic materials. Let's be honest, PVC and lots of the additives in the PVC are a problem, but also I think polystyrene, polyurethane and polycarbonate are still tricky. Minimize migration as much as reasonably achievable. Address the cocktail effect. This is something which is indeed a tough task, but an important one. Refrain from regrettable substitution. So we need to really carefully look at the substitute, but also look at the substitution of so say case-by-case basis, not to say you have to have one-for-one replacement for all the current uses of some hazardous chemical. It's been an ongoing issue with the REACH, resulting in a legal cases which the Commission is losing. Ensure that the authorities and agencies have sufficient resources. Might sound obvious, but believe me, someone who constantly since I came to the Parliament in 2019, it's been twice, and it's going to be the third time this year, and I'm putting amendments requiring more staffing, because being in the contact with agencies very closely, I see how over the top they are. And I think if we want a good regulation, if we want a good implementation and enforcement of the regulation, we need people to do that. And we should stop really all the misleading green claims and labels. And last but not least, we have to act now. I think we waited long enough. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Martin. That was very, very interesting, and it resonated. Everything you said resonated with me. Yeah, if I was a European citizen, I would vote for you. I would like to invite everyone in the audience to think of questions. Some people have already posted them in the chat. We will have time to discuss with Martin. I see a lot of questions, comments in the chat. But first, I'd like to invite our other speaker, Martin Scheringer, to please take the floor and share his thoughts with us. Coming from a scientific background as an environmental chemist, how do we approach this topic?
Thank you, Jane, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone, and good morning and good evening in the other parts of the world. My name is Martin Scheringer, and I will speak about the problem of complexity, probably too much complexity in the chemicals area. I'm a chemist by training. I work as a professor of environmental chemistry at the Masaryk University in Brno in the Czech Republic, and as a senior scientist and group leader at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, or ETH, in Zurich in Switzerland. Today, I will not speak about the topic that we often have, which is methods and techniques for the hazard and risk assessment of individual chemicals. That's what we normally are concerned with, how to develop a new method or make an existing method better, or how to understand what the limitations of existing methods are, what kind of data do they generate, and so on. And this is important, and we have made a lot of progress in the discussion and in the development of these methods used in regulatory risk assessment of chemicals. But today I will speak about the big picture of, let's call it, all chemicals on the market, which is more difficult and more challenging as a topic. So how big is this big picture, and where can we start this kind of conversation? And perhaps we can just start by looking at the numbers of chemicals on the market. Before REACH entered into force in the EU, there were lists of what was called the existing and the new chemicals, and the vast majority of all chemicals were existing chemicals. They were listed in an inventory called ANEX, and these were about 100,000 substances. And then there were another 5,000 to 6,000 substances, new substances in E-links. But the European market is just one part of the world, and recently Zhanwen Wang and colleagues looked at inventories in other parts of the world. Overall, they looked at 22 inventories from 19 countries, and they found more than 350,000 chemicals were listed or are listed in these inventories. So it may be that the global market, or the markets, perhaps it's fragmented to some extent, but the global market is much bigger than what we see from the EU. Then REACH came and entered into force in 2007, and as of now, I just checked this morning, Under REACH, there are now 23,285 substances that have been registered, and there are a bit more than 100,000 dossiers for these substances. So REACH has accomplished one of its goals to remove chemicals from the market that are no longer viable, let's say. But still, the number is quite high, and this may be a problem, And why is this? And we may go back in time, let's say 25 years, to understand why there is a problem. This is a graph from an interesting report by the European Environment Agency, EEA. It was published in 1998. It is available on the internet, you can download it. And it shows a bar chart or has these columns. And the column here on the left is exactly this number of about 100,000 chemicals, former existing chemicals that were on the market in the EU. And you can already see there is an indication of the problem, because in the larger brown part of that column, it says little or no toxicity data. And then the question is, at the time, it was the government authorities who were responsible for the risk assessment of existing chemicals. And the question is then, how many of these risk assessments had been conducted? This regime was introduced in the 1980s, and this question was asked at the end of the 1990s. So let's say 15, 20 years of time when the government authorities were working on chemical risk assessments. And the number of risk assessments completed in 1997 was 10, not 10%, but just 10 chemicals. That is shockingly low, and was one of the main reasons why many people agreed that this was not an acceptable situation, and this is also why REACH then was initiated. By introducing REACH, what has been changed, of course, is the roles and responsibilities of the different actors, of industry, of authorities. Also, the regulatory context of all of this has been changed. But what has not been changed is the task as such. It is still the same task of evaluating all these chemicals. And therefore, it is not at all surprising that there are still many problems with missing or incomplete data that would be needed for the assessment of all these chemicals on the market, even if it's a substantially smaller number of chemicals now. Here is a report from Chemical Watch just a week ago where this point is made. It says extensive improvements still needed for REACH, CLP, industry data. ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, reports that after 14 years of REACH, information provided by industry in their registration dossiers still needs extensive improvement. As I said, I don't find this surprising because the task is still huge, and it is a lot of work to conduct a thorough and comprehensive risk assessment of a chemical. And there have been many of these reports over the years that these problems have been there and have persisted. Just earlier this year, in February, also Chemical Watch reported that in the 2020 compliance check, nearly 90% of the dossiers tested or checked needed more data, were not complete. And specifically, it says that what they did in the 2020 compliance check was they looked at 271, or they performed 271 checks for 258 substances and had to request more information in 240 of the checks, which is almost 90%. And what was missing was information on long-term effects on the development of unborn children, on genetic mutations, and on aquatic toxicity. So quite different, but all important endpoints where there was still not enough information provided. So this is the underlying problem of the complexity of the chemical universe or of the substances on the market. This is also something that we see in other parts of the world. Here, and this is a piece of our own work that we conducted a couple of years ago. And here we also included data from the US, from the SmileCast database, and merged them with the European databases. And we arrived at a total of 95,000 chemicals and some basic data for them. And our question in that project was, what are the data that are available for the PBT, the persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity assessment of these chemicals? As you can see here, in this graph, of these 95,000 chemicals, only a very small fraction, about 3%, had data, measured data, on these three endpoints: acute aquatic toxicity, bioconcentration factor, and biodegradation half-lives, measured half-lives. And this is a graph that was published in the UNEB yearbook in 2013, based on our work by Sebastian Stempel in our group in Zurich. So we see this problem of many chemicals that have not been fully characterized and for which it has not been understood what they may actually do or not do in terms of harm. But these chemicals are not just in lists, they're not just listed somewhere in inventories, they are also real. They circulate in the environment, they also reach the human body. And here is a recent and I think impressive and important human biomonitoring study that shows how many chemicals are present in the human body where they should not be. There are many, there are hundreds and thousands of human biomonitoring studies that demonstrate the presence of chemicals in human tissue, but this one is a particularly comprehensive and thorough recent study. What they did is the authors looked at 30 pairs of mothers and their newborns in the city of San Francisco, and they screened for many chemicals in the maternal blood and the cord blood of these pairs of mothers and newborns. And they found a wide range of chemicals, including 55 chemicals that had never been reported before. So it was that was a really new finding to see them in people. And of these 55, 42 are of unknown origin. It was not clear at all where they come from and why they were in the body of these people. And I think that is also very important to see. It's not that a mother was, for example, exposed to some chemical which it was clear that she used it, be it in her work or at home from a certain product. No, it was really chemicals that come from somewhere, nobody really knows where they come from. So that is about chemicals in human tissue, but they are also present, chemicals are also present in materials where we don't want to have them. And that's also what Martin mentioned before in the first talk this afternoon. This is non-intentionally added substances that are present in plastics. So in addition to all the chemicals that are made and used intentionally. And in this slide, you see two chromatograms of extracts from a piece of meat and the package from which or where this meat was stored, and or is the cover of the package. The package was made of polyethylene, and the cover also contained some glue by which it was connected with the main part of the package. And these extracts show now the chemicals that were found in both the or that came out of the cover, and chemicals that then also were present in the meat. And you see then that this is kind of a mirror image, or that there's a connection here that indicates the migration of these chemicals from the plastic, from the polyethylene to the meat. There are two groups of substances here. The POSH are the polyolefin oligomeric saturated hydrocarbons, and they are from the polyethylene. And the MOSH, the mineral oil saturated hydrocarbons, are from the glue. And our concern here is not just that they are present in the polymer, in the plastic, but also present in the meat, in the food that people eat, because normally we would assume a plastic package should be safe and clean, and we would not expect as consumers that these chemicals are present in our food. So what can we do in this situation? And I think we have to come to the conclusion somehow, after now 4 or 5 or more decades of hard work on chemicals assessment, regulatory chemicals assessment, we have to come to the conclusion that we need to reduce the complexity of the portfolio of chemicals on the market, and also need to reduce the chemical complexity of materials. I think that is something we have to face as a perspective. Where would we start with this? Of course, we would not start just somewhere. We would start with the chemicals that are most important in terms of hazards and concerns. And these are, for example, in the EU, substances of very high concern. Just one example, this is PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And as you may have heard, there are many of these substances in use in many different applications. This is a paper by a team, the Global PFAS Science Panel, where I am a member. We published this paper last year. We identified 200 uses of more than 1,400 individual PFAS. And then the question, of course, is which ones of these can be removed? Which of these uses should be removed with the highest priority? And to answer this question, we used what's called the essential use concept. So that's another paper. It looks very similar, but it's another paper from the same team, the Global PFAS Science Panel. And we used this concept of essential use to identify which uses of PFAS would be non-essential and may be removed. And these are primarily uses in consumer items, such as carpets, dental floss, ski bags, climbing ropes, baking paper, bicycle lubricants, skin cream, household cleaning agent, and many more. And in these cases, it could be demonstrated that there are alternatives available that make it possible to have all these products with basically the same performance without PFAS. So that's just an example of how this could be done to make a start on this task, of this daunting task of understanding this complexity and also then trying to reduce it in a systematic way. So in conclusion, I think we have to draw this conclusion that many chemicals are not under control. Many chemicals that we want to use, that we put on the market are not under control. They are only poorly characterized, or even worse, the properties are unknown. They are found in human bodies, and they are found in materials of also many consumer items, daily use items of people, in food and water. And of course, they make recycling difficult because they would then be present in materials where they should not be there. So it's only downcycling that will be possible in the end, as long as we have so many chemicals in the wrong place, present in the wrong place. So I think after many decades of chemical research and material science research that has led to an increasing chemical sophistication and to a lot of insight and knowledge about materials, it is now time to change the direction of research and development and see chemical simplification as a goal of innovation. So this is not meant to go back, but to go forwards. And because it's not trivial, not obvious how we should make materials that are technically good, have a good performance, and still are simpler and than what we have right now. And I think this thinking along these lines would also help to put the chemical strategy for sustainability into practice. Thank you for your attention.
Great, Martin. Thank you so much. Also, a fabulous intervention, a lot of food for thought. I would like to ask Martin Hojsík if he has a response directly to Martin's presentation.
No, thank you very much. It was very interesting. And I had to say there was a big scandal in Central Europe in, what was it, late 2005, where there were samples of carp, and as someone who teaches at Masaryk University in Brno, this is the traditional Christmas fish in the Central Europe. And in those samples, high levels of DHP and other phthalates were found. Now, how would you think that they came? And actually the suspicion was that because the carps are, when they're fished out of the outside ponds, kind of artificial lakes, they are so to say demudding in ponds out of soft PVC. Mm. It's sort of, it's not even a food contact material in per se, because they were not touching, unless accidentally, but this soft PVC was leaking loads of the phthalates into the water in which the carps were settled for a month, and that ended up essentially with a quite high levels in their meat, not just fat tissue, but in their meat. So I think this shows really that migration of this type, as someone from a liberal group, uncontrolled migration is a problem that we need to take very seriously. But thank you for lots of interesting scientific insights.
Thank you, Martin. I think that's a wonderful example. And I actually yesterday I was in a different discussion with people who were talking about how great hydroponics are. And I was saying, are you thinking about the materials that you put in your water into where you're growing your plants? Because chemicals transfer. And I think we have to do much more to educate people that also, if we can't see it, chemicals are everywhere and they're moving around constantly. And we have to get much smarter about the types of chemicals, especially the ones that we use in the food supply. You don't need to necessarily have physical contact between a food contact material and a food. There's also transfer through the vapor phase, through water, and so on. So that's a great example. Okay, so with that, I think we're all ready for an interesting discussion. I see a couple of people already have been active in the chat. Mike Neal, would you like to unmute yourself, turn on your camera? You had an intervention about NIAS, Mike, saying that in plastics they are being looked at very carefully. So
yeah, hi. I hope you like my background. It's better than the one I'm actually in. Yeah, you sort of made this assumption that there was lots of chemicals in or substances. We should use the word substances because that's how they're properly described, not chemicals. You said that there was lots in there we didn't know anything about. Actually, we spend a long time and we spend a lot of money in industry looking at those substances and carrying out risk assessments per the regulations that we have to follow. And we are very diligent about doing that. What's more, our final end users, in my case, some of the big soft drink companies and mineral water companies, are very, very aggressive with all of their upstream suppliers to make sure that there is no issue for those. There will always be occasional accidents that happen. There is no doubt about that, but they are very, very small, minute compared to that which was the norm. So I think just to make an assumption that we don't know anything about it is not correct.
Which Martin wants to respond first?
I actually wrote it to Martin Hojsík.
Hoisick. Okay, well, there you go.
He made the comment. That's when I made it. Comment.
Not sure we don't know anything about it. I think we don't know enough, and it's clear with Martin showed the data about the quality of the assessments supplied to REACH. I'm in contact with the ECHA, and there are gaps in the assessment, and it's also kind of from what I was saying about the lack of, because I think you wrote also about kind of this connection of not looking enough on the REACH information. We're looking at the food contact substances. This is based on my discussion with the different agencies identifying the regulatory problems and kind of what they've been supplied and what they see as the challenges. And that's where for me also the issue is that, okay, I believe that there is time to streamline it more, because I think doing several assessments and assessing parts and not looking at all the different routes of exposure to certain chemicals, but assessing on a piecemeal basis is something which underestimates the risks. And yes, I can imagine that you as a supplier, especially to the big soft drink manufacturers, which have a brand which is pretty much the largest part of their value as the brands of those drinks, you are under a lot of pressure. But that's where I believe also that this is where we need to make sure that the system is streamlined, can be working across the member states properly, and is easy to enforce, and actually also work for the businesses. And I think at the moment it's not doing enough in terms of the protection of health and environment, and complicated. And that's where I think the simplification, both in terms of the chemistry as in terms of kind of how we can streamline the processes more while not undermining the health and environment protection levels, is the crucial task.
So Mike, on the one hand, you feel you're doing a lot, and on the other hand, we also know that requirements and the safety definition in the current regulation may not kind of live up to what the chemical strategy for sustainability is calling for. So there's kind of a gap here. I want to invite Chris Hoisick to ask your question, please. I think you're also more on Mike's side of things, but let's hear what you have to say.
Hi, Jane. Thank you very much. And thank you for two very interesting presentations. I think it was more perhaps a request for some comments than a specific question, perhaps particularly to Professor Scheringer, really, because on the REACH side, one thing that wasn't mentioned was data, and companies also under REACH have the obligation to minimize animal testing. And I think one of the major challenges that companies have had is how much data do they generate that is new, and how much do they use that they already have in possession, particularly for well-established chemicals. For example, we have one where we have an enormous data set on toxicity from the 1970s. This is not according to the methods in the REACH annex, but we would maintain that it's still very useful information, and we place in our REACH dossiers argumentation to say this is relevant data. It's not quite in accordance with the methods of today, but in using it, we can save maybe 10,000 laboratory animals. And I think this is behind quite a bit of the comments on REACH dossiers being incomplete or not being of high quality. And clearly it's a judgment call as far as ECHA is concerned. And in some cases they accept it, in other cases they don't. The final word, of course, is with the regulator. And I certainly understand and appreciate the points, but I think what we fear, if all of these argumentations are now ignored, the amount of burden for animal testing will go through the roof. And
I think we
have
point,
this
Chris.
dual point.
I think we get the point. Thank you. It's an important dichotomy here. Martin Scheringer, please.
Thank you, Jane. Just in response to the two comments, I think I wanted to acknowledge the task of the industry and also the work of the industry. That's also what I said when I showed the results or the chemical report statements. And when I said that the task is still the huge task that was there even before REACH came. And of course, you can't just assume that industry will do what couldn't be done in 20 years by the authorities, that they will do it in a week or in 2 weeks or in 2 years even. And this task is formidable. And in a way, I think REACH was kind of over-ambitious here by stating or defining these deadlines. And this is a challenging task still. And regarding the data quality, this is now something that also takes time and needs to be done. We have to evaluate the old data, as you mentioned, Chris, from these even 70s and 80s, and see what we can learn from them. That is also something that we are engaged in our own group here. And but this takes all a lot of time. So I think the ambitions were very high when REACH came, and that is part of still part of also a problem.
Martin Hojsík, would you also like to respond to that? I know that you're an animal rights activist, so maybe you also have some thoughts.
There was animal welfare. There is a bit of distinction there. I can tell you that these two parts of the movement have a certain competition, but also dispute. No, this is always a balance, and this is always something which needs to be looked at sensitively. And I can talking with the ECHA, they don't take it lightly. And one thing is the work on alternative methods that don't require animals, but the other side is assessing whether the old reports are up to date. This is something which we have to recognize and maybe there is lack of, and maybe what would be called for is to have a certain publicly available criteria, which would also give you a higher level of predictability in terms of what are the types of tests, or where can we move in this area without, so to say, undermining the health environment protection, while making sure that we minimize the animal testing. This is not indeed black and white, but yes, it should be part of what we look at.
Yeah, I agree, and I just want to make two quick comments. I think the first is, science has moved on, right? So, I mean, we can look at data from the 1970s. Some databases even go back to the 1940s. Those are all valid data. But we also know that there are other effects that we need to be looking out for, notably endocrine disruption. And the way that we have tested back in the 70s, it's not compatible with what we know about how endocrine disruptors work at very low doses, they have non-monotonic dose responses, and so on. So we need to move on from this sort of classical approach in toxicology where we do high dose testing and extrapolate down to low dose exposures. It's not based on our current scientific understanding. I think the second point is chemicals that are not tested adequately, they may reduce numbers of animals that are sacrificed to do scientific studies, but then we're testing them or not testing them in an uncontrolled experiment on the human population. So there's a moral dilemma there as well. These are not easy questions. I think it's an important point that Chris made, but we also have to think about, what Martin Scheringer showed, these data on 42 chemicals found in pregnant mother-child pairs where we don't even know what their origins are. I mean, how is that possible? Synthetic chemicals, man-made chemicals.
In umbilical cord blood, there are hazardous chemicals routinely found. Breast milk. This is something which indeed is from my point of view, also as a parent, a cause of serious concern. And that's for me why the urgency to act on it is really there, and it's something which is long overdue.
Yeah, and a moral dilemma. Okay, we've got another Martin who wants to join us, Martin Wagner.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah, just listening to you is very interesting, and I think I really like the scope of that webinar, which is much more political than the previous ones. So I have a political questions to the other two Martins here. I'm thinking about one of the big problems that we're facing with regards to making food contact materials safer is really this deadlock that we're facing between product defense and activism, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts were on how we can nudge the food contact material manufacturers into giving up that stance of just defending their product, saying, continue just like repeating like it's all safe, we've done everything, la la la. I'm just tired of that, to be honest. So how can we nudge them into like really becoming more proactive and really doing something, designing materials that are chemically less complex and that are safer? So it's a very political question, I understand that, but I would just like to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you.
If I may kickstart, it's a really, really great question. And I would say it's something where I have to go deep, because I don't have a simple answer in terms of what is the policy tool. Yes, kind of simple sort of, yes, we can talk about how making on one hand the working, what we see within the REACH debate currently, kind of making the restrictions work, but also making the authorization system work better, and kind of help it to kind of push it also into the food contact materials area. But honestly, what I'm seeing on a horizon, and you might call me naive, but I think this is something which will be very importantly happening within the next few years, is a major disruption in the way we manage materials. And by disruption, I'm not meaning kind of disruptions in supply, What I mean is disruption on the size of what the arrival automobile cost to the whole transport industry 100 years ago. And remember, that time, it was 100 years ago, with all the slowness of the society 100 years ago, it changed within 10 years in the US. Yeah? What mobile phones, smartphones to be precise, cost to unimaginable industry, banking at the end of the day. You know, I think many of you don't go to bank and, you know, you use your phones for banking. I do, pretty much my own family does. So this is what we will see and what we are starting to see in the mobility area with the autonomous and electric shift, what we are starting to see in the energy. And it might take a few more years, but I think there will be a great shake in the materials, because it will essentially be about kickstarting the move to the circular economy. And it's not going to be on if you think that, oh, this is going to be caused by, you know, the policy pressure for saving the planet. That's going to be only a minor factor. It's going to be caused, in my view, by innovation and to some extent a bit of the policy nudging, but the key element is innovation and the search for answers that, you know, to the question, search for the answers to the questions that we even haven't asked, so to say. And this is where I believe it's very important for the industry to really, for its own sake, to start, you know, thinking outside of the box, but, you know, forget about the box, but the approach the problem for perspective. What is actually the whole purpose? What is the whole kind of system, and try to approach from the system thinking. And it might be something which, you know, I can imagine in a day-to-day business management, or, you know, wishful thinking when I have the time. But if we don't create the conditions for it, if we don't help to foster it, then people outside of Europe will come up with it, and we will lose part of the competitive advantage. And it would be sad, I think. And this is what I'm kind of hoping for Europe, that we will maintain it, because, yeah, we lost it in the mobile phones. We, to some extent, lost it in the electromobility. We're catching up. We are quite good in the energy, but we can lose it fast if we mess it up. And I think for the sake of the chemical industry, which Europe still have the largest in the world, and I've been repeating this, the chemical industry, we need to be those who will be at the heart of disruption in the chemical industry, which will massively affect the food contact materials.
If I may quickly?
Yes, please.
I would put some hope, in addition to all what you have said, Martin, into the food brands. So the customers of the chemical industry who makes the FCMs, and the food brands are exposed to the consumers, to the end users, the people like us, because people may just request simpler and, let's say, cleaner or safer materials, in at least for their food containers. And the food brands may react to this. So in addition to regulation and regulatory frameworks, including the CSS, I would hope that there's also some kind of, you may call it a pull, a push, and a pull. Push is regulation, and a pull is perhaps what the consumers want. And that's something I would hope would happen, and would hope. I mean, I think that makes sense. It's a useful process. And Chris Hojsík just wrote in the chat that they are also using already making less complex materials. So I think that is really a direction that is coming, and that people are aware of.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. And I think that's a wonderful statement to end this hour. It's amazing. Time went by so fast. I think in order to have people demand the right products, we, especially at Food Packaging Forum, are tasked with educating people what they should be looking out for. So I think that's also a nice motivation for us to continue our work in raising awareness for these issues. Martin Hojsík, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're incredibly busy. You're working for 800 million people to make their lives better. So thank you so much for that. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for the invitation. It was really a pleasure.
And also Martin Scheringer, thank you so much for being with us today and for this very, very clear information on a very, very complex topic. Now, before I leave the Martins and everyone else in the call, thank you to Mike and Chris and Martin Wagner for asking your question. Thank you for contributing. If you want to continue this conversation, please join us for our Food Packaging Forum annual workshop, which takes place in early October. It sounds like it's far away, but we're already filling up the spots for the workshop. So please come and have a look on our website. The program is amazing, diverse stakeholders, great discussions, and I guarantee that you will take away something new from that event. So with that, I like to end our session today, and thank you so much for being with us. Take care.